Welcome, everyone. I'm Angelo Robles to Angelo Robles' Effective Family Office podcast, where I look to distill the best practices and best ideas of the world's most successful families and their family offices. I hope to provide thought-provoking opinions and feature amazing thought leaders to our listeners of the podcast with an eye towards the future of the family office. Today's podcast is titled Holding Things Together During a Global Disaster, How the UN World Food Program is Trying to Save the World. It features special guest David Austin, Director of Strategic Partnerships, United Nations World Food Program. You know, we're really excited to have David on today. We've had several guests in the last couple of months from the United Nations and the World Health Organization, and they've been wonderful thought leaders and really impassioned about what they do. Yeah, sometimes I ask tough questions, and it may make all of us a little uncomfortable, but I don't doubt that their heart, for sure, is in the right place, and they have many, many talented people that are making an impact around the world. Now, for those that will hear this, I already told my live audience, but for those that will hear this in a future video or podcast, I normally do it in a classic home studio, professional sound, backdrop, dressed up. Today, I happen to be outdoors. I'm effectively at a beach area. It's a little windy, and I don't have a super expensive mic, so perhaps the voice quality isn't quite what it normally is. And I'm experimenting, so I know I don't have to be housebound all the time to do these effectively near daily. Could I do them remotely, even if it's a pinch less in sound quality, assuming my technical capability knows what I'm doing as we record these on Zoom. But on that note, enough of that. David Austin, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Really glad to be here.
Well, you're doing amazing work, and we really want to have a chance to learn more. And why don't we get right to it? How has COVID changed the international landscape for the world's poor outside of America?
Well, it's really changed the landscape. You know, you think of what's happened here in our country, how kids are no longer going to school, people are shut down in their homes. Well, those exact same things are happening across the globe in almost every country of the world. And so for the poor, the very poor who rely on some kind of assistance because they live in a conflict zone where food does not get delivered to a market, so they don't have access to buy it. So food's not showing up, or there's been a climate issue and there's been a drought, or if you've heard what's going on in East Africa, the worst locust infestation in 70 years has wiped out most of the crops in Kenya and Tanzania. They rely on a group like the World Food Program to help, to come in when they don't have access to food. And what's happened now with COVID, on top of these other layers of conflict or climate or catastrophe through locusts, now all of a sudden they don't get to go to their jobs because of the same reasons we don't get to go to ours. But they might not have the ability to telecommute, and their children aren't going to school. You know, 1.5 billion children didn't go to school the last quarter because of COVID. And so for about 300 million of those kids, that was the only place they got their consistent meal. And so it's radically increased the burden while decreasing access to food for these families around the world. And just to put it into summary, Angelo, you know, we've been helping about 100 million people get food in some form or fashion, 30 million of whom rely solely on the World Food Program. We are their only source of food. So we're helping about 100 million. We expect that by the end of the year, there will be 265 million people that need food because of COVID. It's a disaster.
Wow. Yeah, that's really some scary numbers. And, you know, here in the United States, we think that we have that in terms of even food managed, but with all the people being unemployed, laid off, and all the challenges to some level of logistics. Now, admittingly, some of that has gotten better, but these are issues even here in our own country of America. But yes, in many other countries around the world, even if they have so-called a lower rate of COVID, they're still addressing tremendous challenges and some of the same things we're going through, that, the traditional school programs of the kids getting off to school, a sense of community, of learning, of getting food programs in school. And again, some of those things for sure are applicable here in the States as well. But I think those are, amplified, I guess you could say, in many other parts of the world. This is the only thing I could think of in my lifetime, and I'm not young, I'm in my mid-50s, that really has impacted the world. But I guess unless we go back to a world war or the Spanish flu, pandemic of 1918, that would make us pretty old, I might add. I mean, this is something that we're just going through at the moment that we don't have experience in dealing with.
Yeah. And that lack of experience, creates all kinds of uncertainty for an agency like ours, where we have to step up, or other large agencies, even national governments. So many governments, all of a sudden, they've lost all their revenue. You think of a poor country like the South Sudan. They get 98% of their government revenue from oil exports. Well, oil, as you know, because people aren't driving their cars, airlines aren't flying, oil has dropped down, into record low numbers. So the South Sudanese government, which is already tremendously poor, they've lost 98% of their revenue. And so their people, who are already suffering, it's one of our major areas of operation, it's exploding. Hunger is exploding in a country like South Sudan, or in Nigeria, where 10% of GDP is dependent on oil. So you've got oil revenues are dropping because of coronavirus. And then you've got this big lockdown where people aren't going to work. Well, what the lockdown means for the working poor is they don't get to work. And then you think of the house cleaners and cooks and people in this country in our country, in the United States, who are working in agriculture. So many of them are refugees, or they are immigrants here legally, but they send their remittances back to their home country. Yeah. Well, when they're not working, they can't send money home. So this year, $900 billion of remittances are drying up. And those remittances go to keep poor countries stabilized, like Nepal. I would guess a lot of your family office folks have visited a beautiful country like Nepal, or they've been to Guatemala. 28% of Nepal's GDP comes from remittances earned by Nepalese citizens working outside of their country. So Nepal's income has just dropped radically. And we're seeing, because of the loss of income in these countries, and then we see a tightening of tourism. Tourism isn't happening in Nepal or in Guatemala or Ethiopia. There's no tourism in Ethiopia right now. Their income is drying up, and people react the same way abroad as they do here. They get fearful. And whereas Americans rushed out and bought toilet paper, in Guatemala, they rushed out and bought corn and beans, and then all of a sudden there wasn't the supply for them. And so prices increased by 200 to 300% in the matter of weeks. Wow. For just these staple crops. And then there's export ban. A government responds by maybe having an export ban because they're afraid that there's not going to be enough food in their country. And then supply chains dry up. So you can see how there are these added layers of difficulty for a government or for a household because of COVID. These unknowns create fear, and and hoarding. Even if it's a little bit, that kind of hoarding can stop the supply chain. It can stop economic movement. And that's where, you think of what Roosevelt said in his first inaugural speech. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself, because fear will stop economic activity. And that is a real problem for the world's poor.
That is for sure. I have a question. It may come across the wrong way. It's not meant to. It just is asking a little bit of the question why. And I know one day we're going to look back, and hopefully that one day sooner rather than later, and learn from this to be more prepared for the future. But I look at governments, even incredibly developed countries like the US and other countries, but I look at organizations like the UN, the World Bank, et cetera, and I do have to ask, given that we've had some level of pandemics on a much, much lesser scale, but several over the last 20 years, could I make the argument that we all could have been, I don't know if the word is better prepared, but why don't we run with that for now? And yes or no, but I want, how could we learn from this and adapt to be better at it in the future?
Well, I think, great question. That's a almost a political philosophical question. How do we get better prepared? But I think part of it is this whole idea of fear. In a sense, we have to believe that other people want the best for their families and their communities as well. In general, we've got to believe that others are operating to help their own communities. And so, in this country, at the end of World War II, it was our government that came up with the idea of the UN. It was Roosevelt and Churchill who created this UN system with the World Bank so that we could spread democracy, we could spread free markets, because we felt like those were the institutions and those were the principles that helped liberate people economically. It helped liberate them morally, spiritually. And so this system right now worked from the end of World War II until now. For the most part, Angela, it's worked really well. More people have moved out of poverty in the last 70 years than at any time in history. It's been remarkable. But the last 5 years, there's kind of been this withdrawal of more nativism and conflict, and not just in the United States, globally, we've seen this. And that conflict has created more chaos, which creates hunger, which creates migration. And so how can we be better prepared? I think we have to believe that some of these institutions that were set up by our government for a globally productive environment, those systems are meant to help people, and we should support those systems instead of withdrawing from them. We should invest in those systems and those programs that work to liberate people economically. It's not rocket science, because we can show through the data that investing in these other countries like the US has done, has resulted in greater wealth production for our own country and for others as well.
Excellent.
How's that for an answer there?
I think that's very much excellent points. Getting a little off track, but when I hear what you're doing, which is amazing work that comes from your soul relative to the world's poor food, I do have to also think of agriculture. And I would hope that it's different now, better than it was 10, 20, 30, 50 years ago. Have there been any major advancements, whether I could think of challenges like maybe water shortages and soil erosion and climate change. I understand those are all going to be negatives. But when you talk to people that are, I'm going to use my friends in Silicon Valley, the techies, and others around the world, are we on the cusp of anything from a technological advancement that could eradicate the challenge that we have globally with food that may happen in 10 or 20 years? Is that possible, or a pipe dream?
Sure. No, that's not a pipe dream. But there's not a silver bullet. There's not one single app that's going to come off of a smartphone that will save the world. But it's a confluence of technology and its integration into agriculture. Our organization works with literally millions of smallholder farmers. These are farmers that have maybe 2 acres or less. And we're helping them with get introduced to smartphone technology. And maybe these farmers certainly don't have a smartphone, but somebody in their community does. And we publish all kinds of weather and market data, so these small farmers can gain access to understanding when to sell their limited amount of product, so they can get a better price. And we help organize those folks. So the smartphone technology is having huge implications across the developing world. There are new kinds of ag production. There are about 70 US universities investing in technologies that are appropriate to grow corn or sorghum or millet in the Sahara Desert, or on the edge of the Sahara, to prevent desertification. And we work with those groups, we work with those universities to help deploy that research and to commercialize it and scale it up. We can, Angelo, this is the thing we've got to remember. We can end hunger. We've reduced global hunger from 50% of the world's population 50 years ago to 10% today.
Wow.
So yeah, I mean, isn't that amazing? From 1965, we went from 50% of the world's population in extreme poverty down to 10% in 2015. It's a remarkable jump. And we can keep that trajectory going. So the idea that we cannot end hunger, that's a lie. We can. We will always have small incidents of hunger when there's a natural disaster or maybe some flare up of a war. If we apply our political will to end hunger, it can happen.
Well, that's good to know. And yes, I agree with you. And it's great to have that passion and that belief, because that really is what spurs, magical things to happen. What is the World Food Program, which of course is what you're active in within the United Nations, and what makes it different than other relief and developmental organizations?
Well, this is an important question because we are different than other groups like World Vision or which I support, or Mercy Corps, where I used to work. These are American NGOs, nonprofit organizations. The difference with the World Food Program is it's a UN agency that can go into places where other partner organizations like nonprofits often cannot. And the other piece about the UN World Food Program is our scale is so huge. We were set up by the UN to be the frontline agency to fight hunger. And so we can go in and operate in places where there's conflict, like in Syria or Yemen, and we then partner with some of the NGOs. But we're different in that we're a UN agency, and our goal is to leave. Our goal is to get out. Our goal is to lay the foundation so that a development agency like a Mercy Corps, World Vision, Catholic Relief Services, Save the Children, that they can come in and do their development work to help get those communities up into a sustainable and productive society. So we go in where there's an emergency or a conflict, and we're that frontline agency. The other important thing, especially during COVID, is we run the logistics, like the airlines and ships, the trucks. We run the logistics for the entire UN organization. So when the World Health Organization or UNICEF gets a grant from the Gates Foundation or from USAID to buy PPE or diagnostics equipment to deliver into these developing countries, they can buy it, but they don't have a way to deliver it. So they rely on the World Food Program's logistics support to fly the product from China or from Florida and get it into Guatemala and distribute it. So we do more than just deliver food. We deliver the UN's humanitarian response. And we don't just do it for the UN. We do it on behalf of all of those other NGOs I just listed. So right now, we are responsible for delivering all of the PPE and diagnostics and eventually, hopefully, other parts of the vaccine delivery for the global community. And when commercial airlines have shut down, we also deliver those humanitarian aid workers into Niger or Malawi, where there's no longer a commercial flight. So over the last 4 months, Angela, we had to create we had to create an airline delivery system to get humanitarian workers into these places. And in the last 4 months, we have moved about 700 747 loads of equipment and PPE to 150 different countries, plus 10,000 aid workers so they can get into those countries. And then we also created a medevac service, because if you get COVID and you're working in Mali and you need to get to a hospital, you probably can't unless we come and pick you up. So what makes us different is our scale and our ability and our services to help every other organization in the world that's involved in global relief and development. We are the backbone of the international community's response for emergencies. That's what makes us different.
How do you use humanitarian assistance, such as food assistance, to build stability, create peace, or even help a country develop?
Yeah. So what we've learned is, just like here in the United States, you don't want to just give out food and create a dependency. And most people don't want to become dependent. So when we go into a place like Ethiopia, where we had this great program during the 90s and the 2000s, when we would deliver food assistance during this famine, we had every family or community that participated, they had to provide X amount of hours of service. Let's say it's 20 hours a month. So if they're going to get food from us, which would consist of, like flour and some vegetable oil, they would devote 20 hours of labor. And through that program, they were able to build roads and trails so that their communities could get connected to the market. We built 80,000 kilometers of those little terraced walls along the mountainsides so that the rainwater didn't wash away the topsoil because the trees had already been cut down. And we were able to create all kinds of pasture land along the terraced hillsides so that their goats could graze, then they could get those goats onto the trails, down to the roads and into the market. So we create these asset programs. Like last year, we built over 10,000 kilometers of roads in Africa through this kind of a program. We have 18 million kids in schools, so that's where they get their food from us. So when we go into a country, we develop a program that the food gets delivered through a school and the child has to attend school. And our requirement is half those kids have to be girls. So we're seeing girls getting educated. We're seeing them become literate. We're getting them fed. And then they get married at a later age and they have fewer children because they have greater economic opportunity. So we do all kinds of reforestation, agricultural development programs to lay the groundwork by digging wells and cisterns, building bridges, building roads. I think we did 3,000 wells last year. That's the most recent figure I have. In 2019, we did 3,006 wells. So that these communities, when they're getting food from us, they're also building assets to make them more resilient. And it becomes a building block for future economic development for that community. And then a group like World Vision or Mercy Corps or Catholic Relief Services as a partner, they can help springboard greater economic activity off of those initial assets. So that's how we do it.
You mentioned that we've had tremendous success taking half the world's population in 1965 that would, let's use the word, go to bed hungry, and knock that down to about 10%. Now we're, of course, impacted by COVID and other challenges happening around the world. That rate of exponentially getting better, and again, you did state, one day we hope to eradicate it, period, down to zero. But things appear to be getting worse and more complicated than just COVID. How could these issues be addressed?
Yeah, well, they are getting worse. So really, like I said, from 1965 to 2015, we went from half the world's population down to 10% being hungry. In 2015, it was about 80 million people in the world needed food assistance. Since that time, it's now gone up to 135 million people at the beginning of this year. We expect by the beginning of next year, it's going to go from 135 million to 265 million. So it's gotten worse this year, and we expect to see it get worse. Most of it is due, even before COVID, it's because of conflict. And that's this nativistic political thing that's happening across the globe. We're seeing greater conflict. We're seeing impacts of climate change. And now we've got COVID on top of it. So we've got to get ahead of the curve. And the way you get ahead of the curve is you help people stabilize where they are. Because if we can get them fed, then we see that they'll stay there. You watch what happens when people don't have enough food. If you didn't have enough food, what would you do? You'd go to your cousin's house, or you'd go to your friend's house, and maybe they live in a different town. And if they don't have any food, you're going to think again, where else can I go? And you might have to leave your state or your country. That's what happens in Guatemala. It's what happens in Syria. We can show through our data and through interviews with everybody who's left their country, because we interview them. On average, they've moved 4 times internally in their country before they leave the country. And they're trying to find stability. So if we can secure them in their spot, we can stabilize and we can do it for much cheaper. We can feed a person per day for 50 cents a day. That's our average running cost in a conflict zone. And this isn't great food, right? This isn't like you're getting a big plate of vegetables and steak and rice and a glass of Chardonnay. This is, you're getting a blend of porridge made with corn and soybeans crushed up, mixed together with fortified oil to keep you alive. But keeping you alive is enough to basically keep you in place. And so helping WFP or organizations like this, we can help calm things down. And then once you have stability, you can start building greater assets that create economic opportunity. Does that answer your question, or did I go too long there?
No, not too long at all. But it does lead me to ask a question to kind of build upon that. It's a little bit of a chicken or egg question, and that is, okay, to end hunger, you want to have an opportunity for, hopefully COVID to pass on, to less global conflict, to controlling climate change better, to opportunities for water, for agriculture enhancements and scientific enhancements, as technology may have an impact on that. So if people are fed, and here's kind of the chicken or egg, to help them get out of the economic conditions that you're talking about, and part of it is simply, I hate to say it, but being born in the wrong country. If you're born in the US, you simply have greater resources and opportunities than being born in, I would say a vast majority of countries around the world. Now that may come down, some people will argue, to education. So, but I'm assuming you can't have better education if you have people that aren't eating, they're distracted, they're going to bed hungry. So how does it come down to education, to medical treatment, coupled with them having food? It's complicated. There's not easy answers here.
No, but there are simple programs that help stabilize that. Like what I was talking about, these school meal programs. I was in a meeting a year and a half ago with the Minister of Education of Tunisia. Now, you think of Tunisia, that's a middle-income country now in North Africa. It's not falling apart, right? There's no civil war in Tunisia. It's stable. And the Minister of Education told us, he said, the first time I ever heard of the United States was when I started elementary school back in the 60s. And our school lunch came in a big bag of grain with an American flag on it that said in our language, a free gift of the American people. And he said, all of our lunches were paid for, and it was just a simple lunch. And he said, but it kept us in school, and it kept me around a table with kids from different tribes or clans that I wouldn't normally interact with. This is the Minister of Education telling us this. And he said, we learned how to get along around the meal table because we were so happy to have food. Now, Tunisia doesn't have a school meal program from WFP anymore because they have grown out of that economic dependency. Now they're prospering. But Libya on their border is a mess. And you know what the Minister of Education told us? He said, we, to stabilize our border, have started school meal programs in Libya along our border so that people don't have to flee into our country. And he said, and we're spreading this message around to other ministers of education to do these kinds of programs to secure their borders. Because when these kids eat together, they learn to get along, they're happy to have the food, they get educated, and they stay and flourish in their own community. It's a simple program. So we have a partnership with UNICEF. We provide this, and this is a partnership that we're building out over the years, and this would be something we would love to have your listeners be involved in. We need help to fund a program and it's going to be in 30 countries. We're going to impact the 75 million poorest children. We have an agreement from the 30 host governments that if WFP helps with the food, UNICEF will provide vaccines, and the schools will provide the educational platform. Over the next 10 years, we'll get 75 million kids through school and fed and vaccinated in the 30 poorest countries of the world. Okay, that will create tremendous opportunities for those kids. It'll create tremendous human resources for their countries. These will be the future programmers and software engineers that are coming out of these countries. Look at what India has produced for Silicon Valley, right? What we want to create that same opportunity. These programs aren't complicated. The politics are complicated, but the programs are not.
You know, you remind me, and that's an excellent comment. I mean, education, of course, potentially is probably the best way broadly we know out of conflict or out of poverty. You want to have a level of education which leads to better political choices, to better politics in general, at least in theory. And you look at a country, actually, going back to 1965, that was very middling and incredibly hot and humid, and that would be Singapore, and how they were able in relatively a short amount of time to become one of the most prosperous countries on earth with horrific natural resources, overly hot and humid weather. Sound familiar? Yet they emphasized and put such tremendous resources, and they probably did some things, I get it, we wouldn't do with a little bit of bordering on dictatorship here in the US, but it was an interesting perspective in 50 years, really closer to 30, how they were able to change the dynamic and culture primarily due to education. And I know you're here to talk more about food, but I think they tie into one another to an extent.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, when you can help, like I said, first stabilize, get the people fed so that they'll stay there. Then they're going to look at what's next. I'll just tell you a personal experience. I've been working with orphans in Nepal for 25 years, these young men, and I met them when they were 12 and 13 years old. And every year I'd go back, a friend and I would go back and spend time with these same young men. And when it was time for them to leave the orphanage, this one guy said to me, he's 18, he said, my biggest fear is I'm not going to have enough food for the next 2 years. And he couldn't even think of what we were talking. We were talking about, sending him to college, go to university. We're going to help you do it. But he was so afraid that he wasn't going to have enough food. And I said, Amr, I said, let me just tell you right now, I personally guarantee that you will never need a meal, that you will never be without food over the next 2 years. Because I could do that. I could pay $20 a month to make sure he had enough food. That was like a few lattes out of my, monthly income. And I said, Amr, I'm going to make sure you got food for the next 2 years. Now let's talk. And I said, do you believe me? And he said, yeah, because he did believe me because I had been coming there for 5 years. And I said, you will not lack food for the next 2 years. Now let's talk about school. What do you want to study? And as soon as we took the fear off the table on food, he could think about study. And this young man now is married, has kids. He's an accountant. He works in the Gulf region, takes care of his family back in Nepal, and takes care of other families. If we can do that, we have the infrastructure and the partnerships to do these kinds of education programs, but they can't happen until we first get food off the table. And this is why the World Food Program is the frontline agency in national security or global international security. Because when people have enough food, they don't have to migrate. They don't have to consider sending their kid into an extremist group in the Sahara region. Like, if you're in Somalia, you're gonna have pressure on your family for your kids to join Al-Shabaab. And the pressure they put on you is, we'll provide enough food. And that's the same with Boko Haram in northern Nigeria. We'll give you enough food if your kids will join. And that is a huge selling point in places where there isn't food.
For sure. And I don't think enough Americans are familiar with that, although the CIA has come out with studies that note exactly what you mentioned. If people have food and a hope, which could come through education, so kind of the 1-2 punch of food and education, the number one reason why there's a lot of issues and conflict relates to basically under 25-year-olds that are not employed and hungry. I mean, that's a terrible combination. And
that's right.
That's going to lead to conflict.
And, I was on a call 3 days ago about this same population demographic. And we're talking about how do we help these young people across Africa who come from these smallholder farms. Well, the way to do it, you take a smartphone and you put an app on there on how they can take their crop and improve it so they're going to make more money. And that app is connected to a global infrastructure of weather data, soil data, ag data, and price information. And those kids learn how to use their phone for economic prosperity for their family. That makes agriculture way more interesting. And so we're working with groups to try to come up with those programs because we've got the data and it's publicly available. This is, again, your Silicon Valley connections. We want to connect with those folks in Silicon Valley who will help create some of those apps. We're working with Stanford right now to analyze a lot of our data so that our data can become a more valuable asset to the communities where we gather it. You know, there's enough opportunity. You were talking about being born in the right country if you're born here in the US. It's not just being where you're born, it's your mindset. And you then mentioned education. Once you give kids some of the tools like an education or a smartphone, they're gonna figure it out. And we wanna empower those kids because I will tell you this, it is the most cost-effective way to promote global development is to invest in these younger generations. Because if we don't, we are going to be paying more than 1,000-fold for military intervention. It is thousands-fold. You know, one of our biggest advocates in the U.S. Congress is Lindsey Graham, who's on the Armed Services Committee, because he knows investing in WFP is a much cheaper route to global foods or global security than having to come in on the backside with military. It is, I mean, everybody gets this. The generals we talk to, they all get it. They want to do whatever they can to support our messaging.
No doubt about it. And I'm glad you mentioned Lindsey Graham because some people would think, oh, this is only going to come on the Democratic side. That's very much untrue. A lot of generals, like you said, and people like Lindsey Graham and others have noted, again, the hunger and education issue really helps to avoid a lot of problems. Now, perhaps with Silicon Valley, relative to technology and Wi-Fi and education now, which is more done remotely, which we're going through because of COVID-19 here in the US, and how aspects of it, I'm not saying all of it, but aspects of it are working and getting better, could create another avenue for how Silicon Valley, the US, could impact the world on the issues that we're talking about relative to food and agriculture, but also relative to education as well. I'm going to move on a little bit. Let's get right to a really important question to you. What does the World Food Program need to meet the demand for hunger?
Great. You know, as a UN agency, most of our funding, we have to raise it. We don't get any funding out of a UN budget. We are accountable every year to go raise our money. So right now we have to raise $28 million a day. That's what our budget need is. $28 million a day to help stabilize the world. We don't just get a check that says, oh, here, you're the UN, we'll give you money. It doesn't work that way for us. We have to raise that money. Many of the Western governments have been generous to us, but they're tapped out. And what we need is more private sector engagement. We need partnership from the private sector, from both individual philanthropists who are willing to put money into the game, but also help design those programs that will help liberate kids into economic opportunity. We need smart people. We have some of the smartest people. We have 200 economists that work for us to do all kinds of assessments to make sure that our programs support market development, that they support growth and economic opportunity. But we need more involvement from the private sector. And I will say this, since we've been talking about Silicon Valley, the UN was created 75 years ago in San Francisco. That's where the charter was signed by the initial member states. And wouldn't it be great if that on this 75th anniversary, the community of San Francisco, the Silicon Valley, the giant tech corporations that are there said, we want to commit to that same UN charter. And instead of just depending on the governments of the world to promote global security, the corporations of the world said, we're going to promote global security. We're going to do that through WFP. We're going to do it through these other development agencies. Because these huge tech companies, I mean, I just saw the other day that Apple has $198 billion in cash. Apple has been the beneficiary of the global system that was set up out of San Francisco in 1945. I think it would be great to see them reinvest in those institutions while the governments of the world are having a hard time keeping them together. Let's get the private sectors to support WFP and to support the UN system and support these NGOs that are creating development that results in educated engineers from India or from the Philippines or from Brazil who are now investing into the Apple and into Facebook and into Google and creating all these tech companies' success. We know that the multilateral, non-bordered corporations who are not bound by borders, they benefit from a free market system. They're the ones who are growing, and we need their partnership. We shouldn't be thinking this is just reliant on the UN and on our government. It's reliant on the shareholders. It's reliant on the citizens of our country who have helped produce and grow and profit from this system. That's what we need.
I'm looking at some of the Q&A here on some of the Q&A here on my phone. So we do have live attendees. They have questions. I'm looking at them now. Some of them, I believe we effectively answered or somewhat answered, but maybe in taking it a bit to the home stretch, we could put a succinct bow on it before we get to even how family and family offices could directly look to make an impact and be involved. So one question is, how does the poverty worldwide affect the U.S. economy outside of impact and wanting to make a difference? Why is this an issue for us to take on?
Well, I will say this. It's a very good question, but you have to be thinking long term, right? George McGovern, who helped start the Food for Peace initiative under President Kennedy, that's what it was called, Food for Peace. That's where we sent American crops and sent them abroad to feed people. And just like that minister of education in Tunisia, that was his introduction to the American people when it said a free gift of the American people. In Yemen, where we are currently feeding almost half of that country's population, they have shared with us that they love American soft white wheat that comes from the Pacific Northwest. When Yemen is not in conflict, it imports 90% of its food. Now that they know they love American soft white wheat, where do you think they're going to be buying that soft white wheat when their country's no longer at war? So through this generosity of the American people, the rest of the world has been introduced to American agriculture. I'll give you a quick stat. 3 billion people in the world over the last 50 years in 150 countries have received food assistance from the United States. I'll say that again. 3 billion people got food assistance in 150 countries from the American people over the last 50 years. And this has introduced them to the greatness of American agriculture, the greatness of American technology, and the generosity of the American people. It's one of the reasons we have benefited politically, culturally, from our position as a leader in this system that we helped create.
That is for sure. And I think we should never forget that generally Americans and Americans of great wealth tend to be very philanthropic and beneficial globally to society. We're a very, very charitable country. If you look at us charitable dollars, and perhaps we again have some of the economic flexibility to do so, but comparative to even other developed countries, the US, especially for our scale, is very charitable and philanthropic, broadly speaking. On that note, how do individuals of wealth, of great wealth, of family offices, corporations, family offices, Silicon Valley, especially in the new age of technology, communication, innovation, how could they help to create or help fund and be impactful to the solution to help end this?
There's no shortage of ways, but I'll give you a few examples. Let's say one of your family offices said, we want to adopt a country. We want to adopt Guatemala, and we're going to help fund the school meal program in Guatemala to help stabilize that country. Well, we can help arrange it for them to be a participant in the financing of that. And they can visit those schools. They can be a partner around a country office that we have there. And we work with multiple NGOs and multiple agencies within that country. And then they could, the Walton family from Walmart. They've been very generous towards scholarships for kids from Guatemala to come to the United States and study at the universities. So any of your family offices could get in touch with me. I'm David Austin. I'm at theworldfoodprogram.org, and we can come up. We'd like to know what their ideas are, and if they need ideas, we can give you a lot of them. They can invest in the school meal program. They can help on these emergencies. A huge need we have right now, Angelo, is to get this PPE and all of this humanitarian supply for COVID to the 160 countries that need it. We have to pay for that out of our own budget. We have to go raise $965 million this year to deliver COVID response humanitarian assistance, and that's not even food. Okay, this is like extra to our budget. So even though we have the responsibility of the logistics coordination, it doesn't mean the UN gives us a check to cover that. We have the responsibility to not only perform the duties to deliver that, we have to pay for it. So we of the $965 million that it's costing us to provide all of this air support, delivery support, the medevac services, we've created 2 hospitals for COVID relief for aid workers. Of the 965 million, we've only been able to raise 185 million, and the other governments of the world don't have the money for it. They have said we don't have any more. You got to go find it somewhere else. So we could definitely use help in that. And our executive director has said, I need to he himself is going to make a concerted effort in the U.S., reaching out to high net worth individuals, reaching out to corporations. You've got to help us get around this COVID. You've got to help us support. We need that help. So like I said, there's no shortage of ideas from our side, but I would love to hear the ideas of any of your family offices on how they would like to be involved in the World Food Program's relief for hunger or relief for COVID.
And again, if you could give out your contact info very clearly so people have an easier chance to kind of look you up and reach out.
Yeah, I'm David .Austin at WFP.org. And I would be happy to engage any of your listeners on what some of their thoughts are, and getting some of their investment into this very worthwhile humanitarian cause.
And Joelle, I know you're listening. If you could type that into the Zoom chat feature. David, I'm going to have you repeat your email one more time, please.
Okay, tell you what, I think I can tap into it. David.Austin at WFP. I'm putting it into the chat right there. I think it came to me. Do you see that in the chat box now?
I do in mine, but most of
WFP.
the audience will be listening or viewing. If you could say it one more time.
Yeah, David.Austin, AUSTIN at WFP.org.
David, you've been an amazing guest, really opening up my eyes and hopefully the eyes of our audience, yet also showing not just a vision and a game plan, but how this is impactful to our economy, the impact really globally, more than just simply doing good, and how it really is going to be the right thing to do. And all the inroads we made since 1965 to 2015, and then unfortunately, through a variety of reasons, including COVID, the last 4 or 5 have been a little bit of a pinch of a rollback. But I know in the long run that we're going to win. I'm going to be optimistic. I want to be a contributor, and hopefully my listeners, and again, you don't have to be a $100 million family, a Silicon Valley titan to make an impact. You can make a bigger impact if you're in that position, and that's great. But anyone has an opportunity to reach out to David to help in any way that you could and be impactful. Every dollar matters. David, you're doing great work. We appreciate you.
Angelo, thank you for having me. Thanks for the opportunity to share with your listeners, your family offices. Just as you know, my wife and I both used to work for a family office before I went into the humanitarian work. And I love.
And what kind of roles?
I was in a support role to the president.
Excellent.
Group called Keel Point Advisors, based out of Virginia. And what I found is family offices are trying to look at the world and their family holistically. And how do we use our wealth to promote our values and to promote and protect and support others? And I love the whole concept. And so being a part of the conversation with you and your association is a real honor for me. It brings me back to some of my best working days. I really appreciate it.
Well, it's very kind. Everyone, I'm Angelo Robles. I'm the host of Angelo Robles's Effective Family Office podcast on Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, iHeart, and other platforms, and founder and CEO at Family Office Association, a global membership organization dedicated to families of great success and their family offices, doing a tremendous amount of original proprietary content, hosting global programming. I guess you could argue on hold now because of COVID, but we're busier than ever, doing multiple times per week interviews like today and many, many others with amazing people, thought leaders, and peers, and coming out with a lot of intriguing, I hope, and tremendous content and new resources and masterclasses. Again, like I said, busier than ever before. There's lots to be done. We have to be more active than ever. We need to be resilient. We need to adapt. I to be reached via social media. And by the way, my YouTube channel, where a good percentage of the videos eventually make it up, is simply Family Office. So go to YouTube and subscribe to Family Office. My email, my URL first is Family Office Association, and email is Angelo at Family Office Association. David, again, thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks for having me. Have a great week.
Thank you.